Okay, the big thing that I need to remember is that square and square root are inverse operations. They undo each other. So just like adding and subtracting, if I see x plus 3, I do minus 3 on both sides. If I see x minus 3, I do plus 3 on both sides. So if I see squared in an equation, I do square root. If I see square root in an equation, I do squared. All right? So I see x is being squared. I say, oh, I need to undo that. So I'm going to square root both sides. Okay? Now, if I square root 36, I'm asking myself, what number times itself equals 36? When I think, well, 6 times 6 is 36. But here's the thing. Positive 6 times positive 6 is 36, but negative 6 times negative 6 is also 36. Okay? So I'm going to write like this, x equals plus or minus 6. And that means x could equal negative 6 or positive 6. Okay, now here, this is x is being square rooted, right? X is being square rooted. So I'm going to say, oh, well, if I see a square root, I do the inverse, which is squared. So if I square on the left, I have to square on the right, and I get x equals 5 squared, which is 5 times 5 is 25. Okay. Now, I want to point out a few things. First of all, this answer makes sense. If I plug in negative 6 here, negative 6 squared, negative 6 times negative 6 is 36. 6 times 6 is 36. Look, if I plug in 25 here, the square root of 25 is 5. So check and make sure your answer actually makes sense. I also want to point out here, when I square root a number, I get 2 answers, right? Because it could be a 6 or a negative 6. When I square a number, this just means 5 times 5. That's 25. There's only one answer. Okay, and those observations will carry all the way through even as the problems get longer. Okay, so here I see a square root, I'm going to square, right? So I'm going to square on the left and square on the right. The square root and the square cancel. Now look, I'm not squaring this number. This square, the only thing it does is cancel out this square root. So I'm going to bring down x minus 4 equals 9 squared means 9 times 9, that's 81. Then I'm going to add 4 to both sides. Okay, and notice again, there's just one answer here. When I square a number, I get one answer. It's when I square root that I get 2. And here's my answer. You can check. Look, let's plug in 85. 85 minus 4, that's 81. And then I square root it, I get 9. Perfect. Okay, here. I see a squared. I'm going to square root. If I square it on the left, I square it on the right. The square root and the square cancel. I'm left with x plus 3 equals the square root of 100. Now remember, 10 times 10 is 100, but negative 10 times negative 10 is also 100. So this is where I get that plus or minus. Oh, not 100, right? Sometimes we see that mistake. You got to remember to take the square root. This is plus or minus 10. When I see that plus or minus sign, that means this could be x plus 3 equals negative 10, or x plus 3 equals positive 10. Then I still need to get x by itself, so I'm going to subtract 3 from both sides. I get x equals negative 13, or x equals 7. Look, let's check. If I plug in negative 13 here, that's negative 13 plus 3, that's negative 10. Then when I square it, that's negative 10 times negative 10 equals 100. Perfect. Let's see 7. 7 plus 3, that's 10, and then I square it, I get 100. Perfect. So I'm going to write x equals negative 13, comma 7. Let's come down here. What I notice here is that this piece that's being squared is not by itself. Not yet. It's not on one side of the equal sign by itself yet, right? Here's the equal sign. So the first thing I need to do is get rid of this minus 7 and move it over before I can square root to get rid of the squared. So I'm going to do plus 7. I get 2x plus 1 squared equals 42 plus 7 is 49. Now I have something that's squared by itself, so I can go ahead and square root on both sides. I get 2x plus 1 equals plus or minus 7. Okay, when I see that plus or minus, that's when I split into 2 equations. So I have 2x plus 1 equals negative 7, or 2x plus 1 equals positive 7. And then I'm going to solve. I get x equals negative 4 over here. Seven minus 1 is 6. And I get x equals 3 over here. Again, I can plug in if I want. Look, I'm just going to plug in 1 so you can see. So let's say I plug in -4. That's 2 times -4, that's -8. Plus 1, that's -7. -7 times -7, right? That's -7 squared. Right, oh, look, I'm plugging in here in the middle, in the original equation, excuse me. So that's -7 squared, that's 49, minus 7 is 42. Perfect. Okay, so I'm going to write x is -4, comma 3. Okay, last one. I see that something is square rooted. I can't square it until I have it by itself on one side of the equation. So I'm going to subtract 12 from both sides. Okay, I get the square root of 6x minus 2 equals 16 minus 12 is 4. Okay, now I have a square root. So what do? When I have a square root, I square it. Okay, now careful here, I'm squaring 4. I'm not looking for the square root of 4, so I'm not going to get 2. This is 4 squared, 4 times 4. So I get 6 minus 2 equals, this should be 16. And now, look, I just have 1 4 squared, which is 4 times 4, one answer. And then I'm just going to solve for x. And that's it. Last question. How many solutions does each of these equations have? Okay, look, we're going to observe what we have so far, and we're also going to observe just the structure and imagine how we would solve these equations. So, for this equation, what would I do? I would square both sides, right? I would get 25 over here, and I would just get 25. I'd get one answer, and then I would solve. It would look kind of like this equation, and I would have one solution. Okay. Now here, what would I do first? Oh, I see something squared. I would square root both sides, and when I go to square root this -16, I would say, oops, that has no real solutions. Here, if I square this number and this number, 7 squared would be 49, and then I would just do all the math, right? And in this case, I would get one solution. So anytime I have a square root, then I square it, and I'm going to end up with one solution. Now here, this is where I'm going to square root, and when I square root this side, right, when I square root 1, I get positive or -1, and that is going to get me 2 solutions, okay? So what you're looking for is when you see a square root, that's going to be one solution. When I see something squared, that's where I get the 2 solutions, unless when I go to square root it, I'm square rooting a negative number. That's no real solutions, right? This would be this one.